July 4, 1936. Greensboro, North Carolina, 9:23 p.m. 6-year-old Frank Lucas was hiding behind a tree, watching the worst thing a child should ever see. His cousin Obadiah was hanging from a rope tied to an oak branch, his body swaying in the summer breeze. Surrounding the tree were 12 men in white sheets, their faces hidden, but their laughter echoing through the darkness. Frank's mother had told him to stay in the house, but Frank had heard the screaming and followed the sound into the woods. Now he was watching his favorite cousin die because Obadiah had smiled at a white woman outside the general store that morning. That night changed everything. It created the rage that would fuel Frank Lucas for the next 70 years. It planted the seed of violence that would grow into an empire built on the simple understanding that power was the only protection against powerlessness. Frank Lucas didn't become a criminal because he loved money. He became a criminal because he'd learned at age 6 that the world was divided into two groups: those who could hurt people and those who got hurt. And Frank Lucas decided he would never be powerless again. But to understand how a lynching in 1936 created the most sophisticated criminal mind of the 20th century, you need to understand what life was like for black families in Depression-era North Carolina. This wasn't just poverty. This wasn't just hardship. This was systematic terror, designed to keep an entire population living in fear. The Lucas family worked as sharecroppers on a tobacco farm owned by the Morrison family, white landowners who treated their black workers like property. Frank's father, Charlie Lucas, worked 16-hour days in tobacco fields for wages that barely fed his family. Frank's mother, Mahali, took in washing and cleaning to supplement their income. The family lived in a 2-room shack with no electricity, no running water, and walls so thin that winter wind blew through the cracks. Frank shared a bed with 4 siblings, wore clothes made from flour sacks, and went to school only when farm work didn't need to be done. But the Lucas family was better off than most. They had work, shelter, and food. Most importantly, they stayed out of trouble. Charlie Lucas taught his children to keep their heads down, work hard, and never give white folks reason to notice them. Invisible is safe, Charlie would tell his kids. The moment you stand out, you become a target. Obadiah Lucas, Charlie's nephew, had never learned that lesson. Obadiah was 19 years old, 6 feet tall, and what people in those days called uppity. He'd finished 8th grade, which was more education than most white farmers had. He could read, write, and do mathematics better than the Morrison boys. Most dangerously, he acted like he knew it. On July 4th, 1936, Obadiah walked into Morrison's general store to buy supplies for the Independence Day celebration. The store was crowded with white families preparing for their holiday picnics. Behind the counter was Sarah Morrison, the store owner's daughter, a pretty blonde girl about Obadiah's age. When Obadiah approached the counter to pay for his purchases, Sarah smiled at him. Just a polite shopkeeper's smile, the kind she gave every customer. But Obadiah smiled back, and somebody in that crowded store decided that a black man smiling at a white woman was a crime that required punishment. By evening, word had spread through Greensboro's white community that the Lucas boy had gotten fresh with Sarah Morrison. The story grew with each telling. Obadiah had supposedly made inappropriate comments. He'd allegedly touched Sarah's hand when receiving his change. By sunset, the gossip had transformed a routine business transaction into a sexual assault that demanded immediate justice. Charlie Lucas heard the rumors and knew what was coming. He sent his wife and younger children into the woods behind their shack. He loaded his shotgun and waited on the front porch, knowing he couldn't stop what was about to happen, but determined to make it expensive. The lynch mob arrived at 8:30 p.m. 12 men in white sheets, carrying ropes, torches, and weapons. They weren't random vigilantes. These were Greensboro's prominent citizens: the bank president, the sheriff's deputy, 3 store owners, 2 ministers, and 4 farmers, including Thomas Morrison, Sarah's father. Charlie Lucas stepped off his porch with his shotgun raised. "Obadiah ain't here," he said quietly. "Y'all need to move along." The mob's leader, a man whose voice Charlie recognized as Judge William Hartwell, laughed. "Charlie, we ain't here to hurt you. We just want to talk to your nephew about his behavior today." Charlie knew what talk meant. "I said he ain't here." "Then we'll wait," Judge Hartwell replied. "All night, if necessary." Frank watched from behind his tree as his father faced down 12 armed men with nothing but a double-barrel shotgun and the desperate courage of a man protecting his family. Charlie Lucas was outnumbered, outgunned, and had no chance of survival if the situation escalated. But he stood his ground anyway, because running would have meant abandoning Obadiah to his fate. The standoff lasted 30 minutes. Then Obadiah stepped out of the woods where he'd been hiding. "Don't hurt my uncle," Obadiah said. "I'll come with you." Charlie Lucas lowered his shotgun. He knew that fighting would only get more people killed without saving Obadiah. Frank watched his father's shoulders slump in defeat as his nephew walked voluntarily toward the rope that was waiting for him. The mob marched Obadiah to the hanging tree, a massive oak that had been used for the same purpose dozens of times before. Frank followed at a distance, staying hidden but unable to look away. He needed to witness what was about to happen. He needed to understand what powerlessness looked like so he would recognize it and never accept it. Judge Hartwell read the charges. "Obadiah Lucas, you are accused of insulting a white woman, showing disrespect to your betters, and forgetting your place in God's natural order. How do you plead?" Obadiah stood straight, despite the rope around his neck. "I bought supplies and said thank you. That's all I done." "That's not all you done, boy. You looked at Sarah Morrison like she was your equal. You smiled at her like you had the right. You acted like you forgot what you are." Obadiah's last words were quiet but clear. "I ain't forgot nothing. I just ain't gonna pretend I'm less than human to make y'all feel better about yourselves." Frank watched them hang his cousin for the crime of treating a white person like a human being. He watched Obadiah's body swing in the summer breeze while 12 men celebrated their defense of white womanhood. He listened to their laughter echo through the darkness while his favorite cousin died for smiling at a shopkeeper. That night, 6-year-old Frank Lucas learned the most important lesson of his life. The world was divided into predators and prey, and if you wanted to survive, you had to become a predator. Frank ran home through the dark woods, his mind racing with images of death and powerlessness. He found his family huddled in their shack, his mother crying, his father sitting in silence with his head in his hands. Nobody talked about what had happened. Nobody discussed calling the police or seeking justice. Everyone understood that Obadiah's murder was legal, sanctioned, and would never be investigated. Charlie Lucas made a decision that night. "We're leaving," he told his family. "Can't stay here no more. Too dangerous." But leaving required money the family didn't have. Train tickets, food for the journey, resources to start over somewhere new. The Lucas family was trapped by poverty in a place where staying meant death and leaving meant starvation. Frank listened to his parents discuss impossible choices and made a promise to himself. Someday, he would have enough power to protect his family. Someday, he would be strong enough that nobody could hurt the people he loved. Someday, he would make sure that what happened to Obadiah never happened to anyone ever again. It took the Lucas family 4 years to save enough money to escape North Carolina. 4 years of living in fear, working for the same people who had murdered their family member, pretending that nothing had changed while knowing that everything had changed. During those 4 years, Frank Lucas transformed from an innocent child into something harder, colder, more calculating. He studied power like other kids studied arithmetic. He watched how white people maintained control through violence and intimidation. He observed how fear kept entire communities silent and compliant. Most importantly, Frank learned that the only protection against evil was becoming more dangerous than the evil that threatened you. Obadiah had died because he was powerless. Frank Lucas would live because he would make himself untouchable. In 1940, when Frank was 10 years old, the Lucas family finally escaped to New York City. They settled in Harlem, where Frank encountered a different kind of racial dynamic, but the same fundamental truth. Power belonged to those willing to take it and keep it through any means necessary. Frank's first act of violence came 6 months after arriving in Harlem. A local bully had been terrorizing younger kids, taking their lunch money and pushing them around. When the bully targeted Frank, he found himself facing something he'd never encountered before. A 10-year-old boy with the cold, calculated rage of someone who had watched evil triumph and decided never to be a victim again. Frank didn't just fight the bully, he destroyed him. With a precision and ruthlessness that shocked everyone who witnessed it, Frank Lucas announced that he would never be pushed around, never be intimidated, never be powerless, like his cousin Obadiah. That fight established Frank's reputation in Harlem. He wasn't the biggest kid or the strongest, but he was the most willing to do whatever it took to win. Other kids learned to respect him, fear him, and eventually follow him. By age 15, Frank was running numbers for older criminals. By 20, he was managing territory for established bosses. By 30, he was building the empire that would make him the most powerful drug dealer in American history. But every decision Frank made, every move he calculated, every enemy he eliminated, was motivated by the same driving force. The promise he'd made to himself while watching his cousin die in a North Carolina forest. Frank Lucas became rich because money was power. He became invisible because visibility was vulnerability. He became ruthless because mercy was weakness. Everything he did was designed to ensure that he would never again be a 6-year-old boy, hiding behind a tree, watching evil triumph over innocence. The Carolina Revenge wasn't a single act of violence. It was a lifetime spent building enough power to make sure that what happened to Obadiah Lucas could never happen to Frank Lucas or anyone he protected. Frank Lucas died in 2019, 83 years after watching his cousin's lynching. He'd built an empire, made millions, influenced history, and changed organized crime forever. But in his final interviews, when asked about his motivation, Frank always returned to that night in 1936. "I learned early that the world don't protect people like us," Frank said. "So I decided to get powerful enough to protect myself. Everything I did after that was about making sure I never felt helpless again." Frank Lucas's empire was built on trauma, fueled by rage, and motivated by the understanding that power was the only reliable defense against powerlessness. He'd started as a victim and transformed himself into something that victims could never touch. The 6-year-old boy who had hidden behind a tree while his cousin died became the man who made sure nobody would ever be powerful enough to hurt him the way the Klan had hurt Obadiah. It was the Carolina Revenge, a lifetime spent ensuring that the powerless child became the untouchable king. If this story of trauma, transformation, and the pursuit of power moved you, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you understand how childhood shapes the adults we become. Share this with someone who knows that sometimes Strength is born from the worst moments of weakness. What would you have done in Frank's position? Let me know in the comments below.